This video is a crash course on using Appwrite, which is a backend-as-a-service that allows you to build mobile and web applications. This is great if you're building your own startup or idea. And in this case, I wanted to build out Twitter. It's a platform I often find myself on, and I wanted to build out the front end and the back end, meaning we'll build out how users authenticate, reset passwords, create posts, like posts, and much more. Let's begin. I'll show you what we're building. It'll be a Twitter clone. It'll be able to send tweets as well as like tweets and even delete tweets. It'll be the front end as well as the back end, which will include the database, the sign-in, the authentication, and much more. I'll show you how to build the project, including how to add Tailwindcss. We'll be building it using NextJS for the front end, and for the back end, we'll be using Appwrite. I'm going to showcase what Appwrite is. It is a backend as a service, and it's also self-hosted. This means that it provides a platform for developers to build out pretty much everything they need because all the core APIs are available to build those applications. The real strength is how it works. It comes with all the APIs, but it also has tools as well as a management console with a full built-out UI that allows you to build applications much faster and more securely too. Some of the things you can do out of the box include things like user authentication and account management, as well as user preferences. The database and the storage is persistent, and it has cloud functions and localization and much more. Additionally, it's cross-platform and it's technology agnostic. This means that you can kind of operate it on any type of system, code, or framework. This includes things like traditional web as well as mobile platforms such as Flutter. I'm going to start off with the installation for Appwrite. There are a few essentials we'll need before we get started. And if you want to head over to the docs section for installation, you get more information about how to do this. The first requirement is having Docker. So what I'm going to do is install Docker on my machine. I'm running Windows, but if you're running Mac, the installation should be more or less the same. You can head to Docker using this link over here, or you can just browse it on the web. I'm going to download the desktop version just over here, and the installation is pretty quick and simple. Docker is a platform that allows developers to easily and quickly create and deploy and even manage applications within containers. It's open source, so anyone can download and start using it. And since Appwrite allows you to host your own backend as a service, Docker is the perfect way to be able to do this. Once the installation is completed, you might want to sign in with an account. And if you don't have one, you can create one through Google, which is what I did. This allows you to view your own terminal as well as the web console with all your instances there as well. With Docker installed, we can now run the CLI, which allows us to send commands straight to Docker through terminal, and we'll be using that in order to initialize Appwrite. The next thing I did was open up VS Code. I've created a new folder here called Appwrite-Twitter, and inside here I'm going to create another folder called Appwrite. This is where I want to put the Docker container. There are two files I'm going to create, the .env file as well as the docker-compose file. If you want to know where to grab the configurations for these, you can head over to the GitHub repository, which I'll link below, or you can head over to the main website. Both of these will have links to the files. There will be slight variations depending on whether you're running on Linux or Windows or Mac, but there's details on how to use each environment. What I'm going to do is scroll down here to the custom installation because I want to do a Twitter installation. And down here, you'll have options on how to run Docker. But before that, we need to grab the environmental variables as well as the Docker compose file, which can be found just over here. What I'm going to do is copy this Docker file, and I'm going to paste this into the docker-compose file. And I'm also going to grab the environmental keys, and I'm going to copy those across as well. Be aware there is one variable here called options_abuse, and I'm going to set this to disabled. This variable here currently caps how many requests you can make to the server, and while in development, I don't think we need this because we might be rate limited, but when you go in production live, you might want to enable this again. With all of this prepared, I can open up the terminal here in PowerShell, and I'm going to cd into the Appwrite folder. I want to run the Docker container, so I'm going to pass in docker space compose, and then I'm going to pass in up as well as -d and -- remove orphans. Running this will start the image, and this will just take about 10 to 20 seconds in the background. If you're running Windows, it might ask you to pass in the ports to enable them on the firewall, so I'm just going to do that here in the Windows settings. To test everything worked, I'm going to head over to Chrome. I'm going to go to localhost/login, and I can see Appwrite and its server is now running. I'm going to sign up with a new account. We'll need to do this in order to jump into the dashboard. Here I'm just going to put in my name, my email address, and my password. And I'm going to register. This will take me to creating my very first project. I'm going to just call this Twitter-clone. I'm not going to add in a project ID, and I'm just going to select to create the project. This will take me to the console. Here I can create my very first application on any type of framework, whether it's a mobile application on Flutter or Android, or even whether it's just an API. I'm going to select to create a web app by selecting the web app with the plus sign here on the top left selector. This will allow me to create my application, and I'm just going to call this Twitter-clone. You can also put in a local host environment URL. You will need to set up cores, which we can have a look at later on. But in this case, I'm just going to use the star symbol so that it's available on localhost. I can now begin setting up my environment in VS Code to start using Appwrite. Appwrite comes with its own library called Appwrite, and you can actually just npm install it, which I'm going to do inside of VS Code. Here's the project folder that we had earlier with Appwrite for the Docker container, but what I'm going to do here is cd out of this and close out all the files, and I'm going to go to the root folder. Here I'm going to prepare the front end for the project. This is going to be using NextJS. I'm going to install this by calling npx space create-next-app and calling the project Twitter-clone. If this is the first time you're using Next.js, it is a way to use React on the front end. It is very easy to utilize, and it also comes with a lot of things built in. This includes things like routing, middleware, as well as TypeScript support and much more. And it's why people like Hulu, Twitter, Notion, and TikTok use it for their own interfaces. So here I'm just going to go through the prompts on Next.js. I'm going to select a yes to pretty much everything, including TypeScript. And I'm going to browse into the folder. Here I want to create a new file, .env.local. And I'm going to put in the local parameters here to connect to the Appwrite backend. And in order to do this, we'll have to jump into the dashboard to collect those. The two values we want is the next_public_endpoint and next_public_project. These can be found under settings, API credentials, and the project. Be aware that any values that you copy over to Next.js will be public. We'll paste these in because they are public values, but don't paste anything that you might not want a client to see here. So with this pasted in and saved, we only now need to install the Appwrite module here in the terminal. So let's do that now. All you need is an npm space install space Appwrite. Now it's time to create the database. In order to do this, I'm going to head over to databases on the left-hand side, and then I'm going to select to create a database. Here, I'm just going to call it Twitter-clone and select to create that. The next thing I want to do is create a collection. This is sort of like the table, and for this I want it to be the tweets that we'll have. So this will create the collection called tweets, which we can now configure and customize. In order to use it properly, we're going to need to set up some attributes, and we'll start off with the simplest, which is just a text attribute for the tweet itself. So here I'm just going to call that text, which will be the tweet, and I'm going to set the size to 280 characters, and I'm going to have this as a required field so that every single post or tweet does need this bit of text. With this attribute created, I can test this out by creating a new document, and the document will be, I guess, our very first tweet. So in here, I'm going to write something like, this is a sample tweet for testing purposes. With that created, we will need to assign some permissions because right now this would be not available for anyone to view. So in order to do that, I'm going to head over to the settings tab, and then I'm just going to scroll down to the permissions. Here, I'm going to select a new role, and I'm going to select this for any user. And for pretty much everyone, I want them to have the permission of reading tweets. So I'm going to select to tick that option. I want to now add this database and collection into my project on VS Code. So I'm going to copy the IDs to do this. You can select the tab just up here to copy the database ID. And inside of the .env.local file, I'm going to create a new variable called next_public_database. And I'm going to copy paste that in. Then I'm going to do the same for the collection. I'm going to create a variable called next_public_tweets_collection. And then I'm going to browse into the tweet collection itself and then copy that collection ID as well. Then I'll jump back into VS Code and paste that in. It's time to test all this out using Next.js. I'm going to open up the pages folder and I'm going to go to index.txx. Here I want to import the library and the modules we'll be using from Appwrite. There's two main ones that I want to import, so let's actually import that right now. I'm going to import with squiggly lines from Appwrite, and the two things I'm going to import are the client as well as databases, because we want to create a connection to these. Next, I'm going to create the function that creates that connection. So here I'm going to export a async function. And for the name, I'm going to call this get server-side props. I'm going to pass in context as the actual item or prop that I'm going to pass into this. Now it's time to create the client connection. I'm going to const client equals new client. Then I'm going to connect it by setting the endpoints. Now the endpoints are the process environmental keys that we set for the public endpoint as well as the public project itself. With that done, I can establish a database connection. To pull out the tweets themselves, I'm going to call tweets is equal to await database.listDocuments. I'm going to pass in the database as well as the tweet collection, and I'm going to return this as a prop called tweets. I can now pass this into the home component. I'm going to pass it in straight away here called tweets. And to start off with, I'm simply going to console log it out. So I'll do this above the return statement. To run Next.js, I'm going to simply call npm run dev, and this will launch it. I should be able to browse to the URL localhost 3000. Here it is. And in terms of my console, we can see that the document as well as the very first tweet is available. For the next part of this video, we'll take a look at the Accounts API, which is how we essentially manage user accounts as well as things like authentication, user information, updates, sessions, and much more. There's a difference between the Account API and their User API, where the Account API operates on the scope of the current logged in user and usually uses client-side integration. Basically, this is available through things like JWTs. The User API, on the other hand, works with admin scope, meaning it has access to your entire project and should be run on the server side. To create accounts, normally inside of a project, you can call the account.create method and you pass in a unique ID, email, password, and name. You can also create email sessions by passing in the create email session method, passing in an email and a password. If you want to get the account information for the current logged in user, you can do so calling account.get. This variable can be collected when you create the variable account from calling a new account and passing in the Appwrite client. You can also completely log out a session by calling account.delete session, and this will log a user out of all their accounts across all their devices. Finally, you can also create password recovery, which sends an email to a user, and this can be done with the method create recovery, passing in the email and the return URL. You will need an SMTP server configured with some app variables such as their host, port, security, username, and password, which can be done with any provider of your choice. Now I'm going to create a user sign-up. I'm going to import account from Appwrite, and I'm going to create a brand new function here, which is going to sign a user up. This function should be called later on in the page, but for the time being, I just want to test it out. I'm going to create a new client connection as well as a new client account, and I'm going to set these variables. I'll create the connection to the endpoint and the project I'm working in, and then I'll call account.create. Here I'll pass in a username, email, and password. I can then console log out the response. Now, since I'm using async, I can immediately perform this action, but sometimes it's more useful to do a promise so that you can check whether the actual request failed or succeeded. Let me put some test example content in here. I'm just going to put in Adrian with an email and a password, and let me test if this worked. Of course, I'm missing a button here to be able to call the request. So let me jump back in here and create a button that calls create user, and hopefully this all works. Let me test this out and check console, and here's my brand new user. The next thing I want to do is create an email session, but right now there's a lot of content in this file. So what I'm going to do is get rid of most of the styling as well as content, just so that we have the buttons with our actions. Here I've got the button to create a user. So what I'll do next now is copy this button and create a new one to create an email session. In order to do this, I'm also going to copy out this previous function, and I'll relabel the new function create email session. You'll be using this when you want to log in a user that already has an account that they can use. The only main thing to note here is that we don't need to pass in the username anymore. We just need the email address along with the password. And here I can create that request. So let me actually test that out with the button. I'm going to update to a new email address and copy over the function name over here to the button itself. You'll notice that if I open up Chrome and try and select this, I'm going to get an error, and the error will be that the email address actually doesn't yet exist. And this is because we haven't created a user for this create email session. This is because I was actually testing it out on a new email address. Let's actually use the email that we earlier created for our user, which was adrian@gmail, with the same password being my password. And this time when we select it, it should create a login session for us. And that's essentially what creating an email session is. I know the semantics of that might be a little bit odd, so what I recommend is definitely going in and relabeling the function as well as its call to user login, because that's essentially what we're doing here. If you're interested in other methods to be able to log in with accounts, there's more than just the create account as well as the create email session options. You can also do things like logging in via OAuth sessions. So this would be with an OAuth 2 provider, which you can pass in, such as something like Amazon, for example. And it's really up to you depending on what you're after. You can also do things with login magic URL sessions, and that's where you get emailed a session link where you use that link to be able to log in rather than using a traditional password. And there's much more, such as even doing, for example, phone session logins or anonymous sessions, or even just creating a custom JWT and creating your own session. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at a current logged in session. I'm going to pass in useEffect here from React, and I'm going to use it when the component mounts. Now, what I want to do is create another client connection to the Appwrite server, and I also want to pull in the account. Once the session has been created to the endpoint and project, I'm going to just do an account.get. This account.get method will get the current logged in user, and then I'm going to console log it out. So now let me refresh the page, and I can see here in console my user Adrian T is now available. I'm going to clean this up a bit and make it styled a little bit better by importing useState from React. I'm going to create a useState here for the user, and I'm going to set the state essentially when we perform a check for whether the user is logged in or not. If it is logged in, we'll set the user to be the response.email, and then I want to present that as part of the UI, so maybe something like a welcome with the username being presented. I can test this out, and it's already working since it showcases the email with the session I created earlier. With that done, I want to now create a logout. There's a few ways to log out, but one of the most effective is to delete the actual session. So what I'm going to do is create a new function here called a logout session, and I'm going to create a button for that simply says log out or log off. At the very top here, I'm going to copy over my user login function, and I'm going to rename this. This time I'm going to rename it to say logout session, and I'm going to put in the command which performs this, which is simply to delete sessions. Now when we run in delete sessions, we don't have to pass any variables. It actually checks the current active session and uses that as reference, and then we perform this response here, calling it. The other thing is it's called delete sessions, so I'm actually going to update my own method here for this function to be called a logout sessions, just so that it's always the same, and I'll update the front end here for that button too. With that done, let me test this out inside of a browser. Now I've got the previous login session here. I'm going to select logout. Nothing's happened, but it does have a response back. Let me refresh the page, and it is logged out. What's happened though is that I haven't updated the set state here for my React component to update that information. So this is where once we call that, it would be useful to do a user set state and reset the user to essentially be null or empty to not showcase any of the username there. The other thing I can do is go into the design of the component and check whether this attribute is actually empty or not. And if it is not empty, then I'll showcase hello user. Otherwise, I won't showcase anything. So let me refresh, and I can see that that's empty now. I'm going to log in with the user via email, and I can see that now I'm logged in, and I can select a logout, and that logs out immediately too. Create user via email is probably not the correct syntax here, so I'm going to call this a login user, which we are doing with a login email address. And then I'm going to make sure that this can be selected to log in the user, refresh the page, That's logged me in as Adrian, and log out. If I want to make this even better, then I could, for example, set the state for the user to immediately be set once we perform a login. So let me actually copy paste that here for the response as part of the user login. However, I did check that the user session and its attributes are a little bit different than what you do when you get a user login. So what I'm going to do is try and get both of them to be matching by pulling in different attributes for each. For creating a session with an email address, I'm going to use the .user_id. And then for checking a session for the current account, I'm going to use the $ID. Now, when I log in or when I log out, I'm always getting the same session as well as if I refresh the page. There are other aspects to the Accounts API. We've only really scratched the surface. There's also updating your name or password or email, as well as doing things like password recoveries. If you want to learn more, definitely jump into the documentation where it lists all the methods to be able to do some of these things. Moving forward, I want to take a look at the Database API. The Database API will allow you to create collections and documents and query them. And this is where I want to create a database of tweets that we can access. Now, we already created this database as well as collection, and now we should be able to access these using the create document and list document methods. So jumping back into VS Code, I'm going to do a few things here. First, I want to showcase the tweets that are currently in the database itself. Since we already have this in place, what I can do is just map through them. So I'm going to create a new div here called tweets. And then what I'm going to do is grab these tweets that I have as documents and map them out. I'm going to have the ID here as the key, as well as the tweet text and the created at date. Then I'll close off this div, and that is pretty much all the code I need. Let me jump back into Chrome to test out that this is actually working. So I'm going to open up the browser here on the right hand side. And here I can already see the very first tweet I created when I created the database itself. These are essentially the same documents we're getting when we were console logging them out earlier. What I want to do now though is also create new tweets. And in order to do this, I'll need a new button. So when a user logs in, and they should be able to create a tweet. I'm going to select one of the buttons I had earlier, and I'm going to copy paste across to make a new one. And this one here, I'll just call create tweet. Here, I'll just make the button say create tweet as well. And normally you would have a text box, which you could put in the text the user is creating for this. But for the time being, I'll just create a quick, simple function to make sure that this is actually populating a new document in the collection. So what I'll do here is I'll create a function called create tweet. And here we previously were accessing the client and the account methods and classes. But I'm going to get rid of all of these because this time we'll be accessing documents and databases. So I'm going to pass in const databases is equal to new databases, accessing the client here from Appwrite, making sure all of that is imported. The next thing I'm going to do is create the client connection. And finally, I'm going to start using the databases and its methods. And in this case, I'm going to replace accounts with databases. And here I'm going to create a actual document. So I'm going to pass in .create document. I need to pass in a few values here to be able to create this document. The very first value is the database itself that I'll be using. This is the environmental key we set earlier with that ID. I'm also going to pass in the tweets collection. This was also an environmental key we passed in earlier. And finally, we need the document ID as well as the document itself. I would recommend an ID generator, but in this case, I'm just quickly going to pass in tweet and a quick object that says hello world. If I test this out in Chrome, there's one other issue that'll be popping up in the console, which is that the user doesn't have authorization to create these actions. And this is because we didn't actually update the permissions in terms of this collection and what users can actually do. In the past, users could only read tweets and they couldn't actually make tweets. Let me jump back into the project itself. So that'll be in databases. I'll select the Twitter clone and I'll select the collection of tweets. Here, I'm going to head over to the permissions under settings. Then I'm going to scroll down to update permissions. Instead of any permissions, I'm going to go to users and add users to read and create. If I test this out now, I can open up the console, click create tweet, and here is the tweet with all its details. And if I refresh the page, I can see it popping up here just below saying hello world. It is worth noting there is a storage API, and this works really well with databases and collections, where you can upload different types of files from the console or directly from clients and display them later, such as images, PDFs, documents, and much more. And this can be useful, especially if you're building out a site like Twitter. To add to that, there's also a functions API where you can create custom behavior depending on what you want to trigger. And this can be used directly through the CLI. So if you, for example, are running an Appwrite project, you can create your own functions that have their own unique name and run inside of node.js. You'll need to import and set up the variables for the function itself. So an example of that could be like tweet by ID. And this could determine exactly how many likes a tweet has and then increment that each time a person does another like. Now, without going into very specific detail, which could take hours on covering every single one of these elements, I'm going to jumpstart the rest of this project and import some of the preset files so that we can get it up and running. Now, I'll start this very soon, but first I'm going to configure the tsconfig file, as well as a few folders to utilize as part of creating the authentication. I'm going to create folders including utils, hooks, as well as components and libs. Then under compiler options under paths, I'm going to reference these folders with an @ so that they can easily be referenced later on in the project. There are some styling and updates that I've performed where I've created some basic components. So what I'm going to do is browse into the components folder and just copy paste those straight in. I'll link this in the description along with the GitHub repository in case you don't want to build all these components from scratch. With that done, I'm going to set up the libs folder now. I'm going to create a folder inside of here called Appwrite, and I'm going to create 3 additional files in here. The files I'm going to create include index.js. I'm also going to create one called Appwrite, and finally I'm going to create one that's called server appwrite.js. For the index.js file, I'm just going to export it calling appwrite.js. And then on the appwrite.js file, I'm going to create a basic connection that can work as a wrapper for future use, so I don't have to constantly retype this. So here I'm going to import the client, and the client will create a new client connection to the public endpoint and the project itself. And then I'll export that. For the server for Appwrite, I'm going to do more or less the same thing, but it'll be the server version of that. So I'm going to import the SDK, I'm going to create a client connection, and here I'm going to export that. In terms of that client connection, I'm going to set the public endpoint, the public project, as well as an API key. This key will need to be defined in the end.local file. So here I'm going to create a new value for this. I'm going to head back over to the web console and head to settings as well as to view API keys. Here I'm going to create a new API key, and here you can define a scope of what you want that key to be able to access. And there is an important part of this, as best practice normally suggests that you should only allow the API key to access what you want. In this case, I'm just working in dev and I want the API key from the server to be able to do pretty much everything. So I'm just going to select all the ticks. I'm going to copy this API secret and I'm going to paste this now into my environmental key here inside of .env.local. Of course, it should go without saying, but don't show this to anyone. I'm also going to install a library called Classnames. I'm using it as part of the components I imported earlier, so I'm just going to do npm install Classnames, and it should show up here in the packages.json. One more library I'm using is Tailwindcss for the styling. I'm going to install this as part of the project, just following the documentation here to do an npx install on Tailwindcss. I'll jump back into VS Code, paste this into the terminal to get the installation running. I also need to initialize it, which creates a configuration file, so I'll copy paste the init command here below. With the actual configuration in place, we can start adding in some of the configuration details, such as this one over here, which is more or less the same as it should initialize with. I'm also going to copy out the global styles here, which basically reference Tailwindcss's base components and utilities. And I'm going to jump into my own styles folder, which is just here, and open up global. I'm going to replace all this content with these Tailwindcss ones. With that done, done, I'm going to copy paste some of the pre-made UI that I've developed for this. These are just using the same functions we created earlier, but just replacing it with some better styling. As mentioned again, all these files are in the description if you want to save yourself some time from doing the UI. So I'll get rid of some of these initial files that we had in place of these updated files. And the other one here was some hooks that I originally had added, so I'm just going to drag that into the hooks folder. I'll cover how these look shortly, but before that, I'll also install 2 more packages. This will be the headless for React, as well as the hero icons for React that I'm using as part of some of these pages and these components to create some of the icons that we need for Twitter. With that done, I can now do an npm run dev, and I should get the web server up and running. You'll notice that everything's more or less the same. We've got our 2 tweets here, but now we've got a nice interface for Twitter. This also means that we can comment on tweets, like them, as well as tweet, and we can also log out of the session to log in with a brand new session. With all this done, let's now have a look at the database to expand it out in preparation for creating a better version here for Twitter. Right now, our tweets only have one thing, a text value. Let's also add in a username, which can be a string, which is required, and let's make sure that the minimum characters here are 128. I'll also have one more item here. I think I'll do the user email. So let me pass that in, and that'll also be a string, 128, and it'll be required. Twitter also has something called Twitter Blue these days, and this allows you to update and even delete tweets that you have, and I think that's pretty cool. You can do this as well with Appwrite using teams. I'm going to create a team here, and I'm going to label this team Twitter Blue. This will be a special team or group that we can set up special privileges to. You can also create groups or teams like this for things like admin users or, well, essentially any type of group you want, whether that's subscriptions as well. I'm going to head back to databases and head over to Twitter clone and the collection here for tweets. And I want to select the settings down here, and I want to scroll down and add the new role here for teams. And for these permissions, I'm going to select Twitter Blue. And for this group, I'm going to allow them to create, read, update, and delete different types of entries. With all of this done, let me test this out by heading back to the homepage and performing a login or a sign-in. I've got the adriant@gmail.com and I've got my password here. I can sign in, which is great. I can now add a new tweet. So I said hello post, which actually worked quite well. And I can't like any of the tweets yet. I want to create a special function inside of Appwrite to showcase how this can be done. For this next part, I'll install the CLI for Appwrite by running npm install -g for global appwrite-CLI. We can use this to link the existing library here to Appwrite. So I'm going to do Appwrite space login using that CLI and using the login for hello@adriantwarwick.com as well as my password. This logs the CLI into my account, and now I can initialize my project. I'm going to select to link my project here, which is the Twitter clone. And with that, I can now create my very first function. To do that, I'm going to call the CLI and write Appwrite init function. And I'm going to create this function, and it's going to actually create a new folder. So first we need to name the function. I'm going to name this function like tweet by ID. And I'm going to leave the rest default, so a unique ID will be generated and it'll be using node.js. Here in the folder, we can see that it's been created. We have an index.js file, which is the function itself. And there's a few parameters here that we still need to set, which include the variables for the environmental key. So what I'm going to do is jump into the console. You can see that the function has been created here inside of the Appwrite console. We can actually copy the ID for using this a little bit later on, but I do need to set the endpoint as well as the API key. I can head over to settings for this specific function and I can update my variables. So I'm going to set those 2 variables that I have, and they're preset. So I'm just going to write them in manually. The first one is the Appwrite_functions_endpoint. And this is the URL you're currently hosting on. So if, for example, you're on localhost, then put in the IP address of your computer. Normally it should look something like this. You can do an IP config or check your network settings. And for me, this is a classic 192 address. I'll copy this in as the first key, and then the second key is the Appwrite function API key. This can be found on the general settings on your project. So I'm going to go back into the console, go to settings, go to view API keys on the right hand side. And for security purposes, I'm going to create a brand new API key specific for these functions. And I'm going to just check functions on the right hand side here. You can also have a look at the API key, but normally you want to keep it hidden, so don't share this with anyone. And then I can jump back into functions to like by tweet ID to settings, and I can scroll over to the function API key and paste that key in. Heading back to VS Code, there is one more key that I completely forgot about, which is the actual project ID. So I'm going to copy paste that in and create a variable for that. If you don't know where that is, you can head over to the console itself, just to the very start of the project, and you can select to copy it directly from there. I'm going to paste that in, and that's our final key that we need. Heading back to the project now, there's a couple of things we can do. We can get rid of some of this additional syntax which we're not using, and we can start putting in an update here for when we do a like to the database. In order to do that, we're going to paste in the databases. We don't have to actually import this because we're using the SDK directly. So I can just reference sdk.databases and pass in the client. The next thing I'm going to do is pass some information to this function. I'm going to pass it a payload, which will include the tweet ID as well as the likes. And then when I do that, I'm going to be using these values later on. I'm going to JSON.parse them because they'll come in essentially as a request payload. And then after I check that we've connected properly to the server, this is the client connection that we've done here. I'm going to do some modifications to that tweet. So here I'm going to set a new object for the tweet. If that tweet actually exists, then what I'm going to do is essentially I'm going to create a database.update to the document. I'm passing in two values here, which is the project as well as the collection, the tweet ID, and then the update to the likes themselves. And then I'm sending that back as a data response here with new tweet. One thing I forgot was that this is a database update. So I do need to jump into the API key over here, and I'm going to have to update it so that the scope does include changes to the database. So let me tick that and click update. And the other thing I need to do is probably reference the collection and the project better. And to make these easier, I'm just going to label them, and I can jump into my environmental keys and literally copy paste them out. Although I do understand that it would probably be better to set environmental keys, but I'm just a little bit lazy right now. With this function done, I'm going to deploy it. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to select create deployment. This is actually done through a console. So if you have a look, if you're on Linux or if you're on CMD, you can copy out the command. I copied out the CMD command and I put that into my terminal, but unfortunately that didn't actually work. And the main reason is because my terminal is actually running inside of PowerShell. So I didn't copy out the right command. I did jump back in and scroll down to PowerShell and copy that out to run instead. And when I pasted that in, that actually didn't work either. And this is because I believe the syntax might have changed compared to the documentation. So what I did was jump into the command prompt, did some debugging of my own, and figured out that the correct syntax is Appwrite deploy function and then create deployment after the fact. Here I can select like tweet by ID and I can deploy that function. If I jump back into the web console now, I should see that function active and running, and here it is. I was missing one more thing, which is needing the execution access. So I'm going to add in the role for users to be able to execute this function. I'm also going to jump into the attributes for the tweets, and I'm going to add in likes. This isn't an attribute we had before, so since we're doing that now, I'm going to attribute this with a minimum value of 0 and maybe a max of 9,999. I'll have this as a required attribute with the default starting off at 0. Jumping back into the demo, I can jump in here and select to like a post, and now it works. I'm going to clean up some of the rest of the database. I'm going to update my name here to Adrian Twarog. This should now properly show on the interface. I'm also going to add myself to Team Twitter Blue. And by adding myself to this as a membership, I should be able to do some additional things on Twitter posts, which are things like, say, editing them as well as deleting them, because right now I wouldn't have the permissions to do that. So now if I go to my user account under memberships, I'm there in Twitter Blue. And if I was to browse back to the Twitter application and select to delete the tweet, that deletes instantly. Now let me show you how some of this works. Let's open up the components and head over to tweet and select tweet.js. Here is a file, and we have that function we just ran, which is onRemoveTweet. We also have the connection here to the databases, and this is using the wrapper for the Appwrite. We're calling the method here delete document, passing in the database, the collection, as well as the tweet ID, and then we're removing the tweet from the UI, which is calling onTweetRemoved. There's another function in here, such as onLikeTweet, and this is where it's calling the functions API. And this is the functions API that we created earlier, but it's simply just doing an increment to the tweet likes. So you can see that here, as well as updating the UI with that update as well. In terms of most of the content, you'll see that it's running Tailwindcss. There are a lot of classes making this happen, and this would take quite some time to write this out manually. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how to do this from a broad spectrum, but I've got Tailwindcss videos if you want to check those out. I've got the methods in here for some of the buttons, and they're clickable via just the SVG icons that we have. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks to Appwrite for sponsoring it. They make videos like this and others happen. If you want to check them out in the description below, definitely do that. It was really fun building this Twitter project, and if at any point in time you guys get stuck, there's also a public repository on GitHub, which I'll share in the description as well. On top of that, Appwrite are releasing their cloud version very soon. This is currently in private beta and allows you to do all of this directly in the cloud rather than having your own Docker container. If you have any questions about the project itself, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll look forward to the next video, which will probably be covering the Appwrite cloud. And if you have any suggestions for that, let me know as well.